Здравствуйте, товарищи, and welcome to a new video. In this video, I'm going to be talking about the Soviet belts and buckles of the Cold War. I hope you enjoy. So, when we start from the left side of the camera, we have an example of a Soviet Naval Infantry's belt buckle from the 1950s and 60s. These belts would have been introduced around the late 50s, early 60s, and would have been used up until the end of the Soviet Union, so 1991. The example you see here is a galvanized steel belt buckle with a canvas rubberized black belt. As many of you would have known, the Soviet naval infantry used black equipment. Therefore, you see black belts being used along with black shovel carriers, black pouches, and whatnot. These belts by themselves wouldn't have been used, but the brass buckled service dress belt would have been used as the main example of the naval infantry belt. These would have been used more for military exercises and so-called combat operations. But as you know, there weren't many combat operations during the Soviet Union. So in most cases, you tend to see the brass buckled leather belts instead of these rubberized canvas ones. The second example we have here is for a motorized infantryman. I use these for my 1960s and late 50s uniforms. It is pretty much the same belt as before, predominantly used for military exercises and so-called combat operations, and most of the time even seen as late as 1990 still being used. So a very long lifespan for a belt that was made in the 1960s. The design itself is pretty much the same, but it only has the motorized infantry insignia with the basic star and Soviet symbols. And this one also sadly doesn't exactly have a date stamp that is left. These are really old belts, so it's hard to get the exact date numbers on them, sadly. But I'm basing most of their age due to the pattern of their year of manufacture. So this is a 1958 pattern, 1958 model that was introduced in 1958 and used up until the 1990s. Now, this leaves us with the most common belt that you see, which is the brass buckled leather belt. These are predominantly used for dress occasions and just walking out. But you sometimes see the brass buckles being even used in military exercises and in Afghanistan. The main reason for this is by Soviet mentality, these are peacetime belts, and the invasion of Afghanistan wasn't seen as a war, funny enough. Therefore, you don't see these combat belts being used in Afghanistan at all. These would have been highly praised by soldiers because of their looks and feel, due to the fact that it is a very nice leather. I presume this is from the 1960s or early 70s due to the quality of the leather. I got this in a fairly beat up condition, but I was able to restore it to its former glory, as we say. This one also doesn't have any markings on it aside from a soldier's serial number on the inside, which is, I find it very nice to have an actual belt that was used. There were also other examples of these belts, such as the thicker leather one, which was intended for combat operations as well, for load-bearing equipment, but I don't have an example of. But I do have an example of a fake leather belt, which is intended to be used with a brass buckle. These would have been hated, absolutely hated by soldiers due to the fact that they are not real leather and don't really have that soldierly aesthetic to them. They are cheap, they are less labor intensive to produce, and definitely a sign of the fall of the Soviet Union, if you ask me. Therefore, I'm using it with the Afghanka, so like the later periods of the Soviet Union. Aside from that, it is a fairly basic belt with a different style of hook adjustment system, hook loops. There are movable on both sides, so you can adjust it on both sides instead of just having a single adjustment point. And aside from that, it is pretty much the same as the previous one. These would have been used up until the end of the Soviet Union and even beyond during the 90s, and some post-Soviet countries still use these buckles for their cadets and whatnot. So this one is a nice example of that, even though it's not really nice. Finally, this brings us to the most common belt you see in the market, which is the so-called World War III belt. It would have been issued in case of a nuclear / conventional war between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. These would have been used for field use, therefore they are subdued and not the brass buckle ones, or the regular, they're not the brass buckle ones. Unlike the previous models, they were never issued. There is not a single evidence to support these belts being used during the field exercises or any maneuvers. Most of the time you see the previous models I talked about in exercises, and some people tend to confuse them due to the fact that sometimes these were painted to green colors by the soldiers themselves, but the shade is quite different than the brownish green you have on these. So it is really easy to tell whether or not these belts were used by the Soviet Union. The short answer is no. But they were used during the Soviet-Afghan War by the Afghan National Army, and there are a few photographs of them being using these. The construction is fairly similar to the previous field buckles, field belts, which I presume is due to the fact that they're newer and unused, unlike my other examples, which are fairly beat up and have wear and tear on them, which presumably shows a short service life, or at least, the age of them, because as you know, rubber gets harder with age. Interestingly enough, just like the other belts, it does have a fairly simple adjustment system, unlike my other belt, which came also late around the late 1980s. It does still have the regular style, which is only one adjustment point on the left side, which is interesting to say the very least. I hope you guys enjoyed this short little video about the Soviet belts and buckles. I hope to make more videos about the military uniforms, equipment, and whatnot in this style more often. And I hope you guys enjoyed it. Please, if you have any comments, anything to ask, please do ask them down below. If you haven't subscribed, subscribe, leave us a like, and yeah, I hope to see you guys in the next video. Thank you.